When my wife Sarah and I bought our dream house on Maple Grove Drive, we thought we'd found paradise. The neighborhood was picture-perfect with manicured lawns, white picket fences, and that suburban charm you see in movies. What we didn't expect was to meet Karen Middleton within our first week. Karen was the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates, HOA, and she took her role more seriously than a Supreme Court justice takes constitutional law. She showed up at our door on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, wearing a power suit that screamed, "I am very important, and you should listen to me." Her smile was as fake as a $3 bill, but her eyes gleamed with the kind of authority-hungry enthusiasm that makes normal people want to run for the hills. "Hello there, new neighbors. I'm Karen Middleton, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Welcome to our wonderful community. I'm here to get you all set up with your HOA membership and go over our community guidelines." She thrust a thick packet of papers toward me like she was handing me the keys to enlightenment. I glanced through the documents and nearly choked on my morning coffee. The HOA fees were $800 a month, and the rules read like something out of a dystopian novel. No parking on the street after 6 p.m., no lawn decorations except pre-approved seasonal items, no outdoor furniture visible from the street, and get this, no barbecuing on weekdays because the smoke might disturb the neighbors. I looked up at Karen, who was practically vibrating with excitement, waiting for me to sign on the dotted line like an eager puppy waiting for a treat. "Actually, Karen, we're not interested in joining the HOA," I said politely, handing the papers back to her. You would have thought I'd just told her that Santa Claus wasn't real and the Easter Bunny was a fraud. Her smile faltered for exactly 2 seconds before snapping back into place, but now it had a sharp edge to it that could cut glass. "Oh, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone that customer service representatives use when they think you're an idiot. HOA membership isn't optional in Willowbrook Estates. It's mandatory for all residents. The previous owners should have informed you of this during the sale. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to drag us kicking and screaming into her little kingdom of petty tyranny. "I'm sorry, but you're mistaken," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "We did our research before buying. This property isn't part of any HOA. The deed is clear, and our attorney confirmed it during closing." Karen's eye twitched, and I could tell she wasn't used to people challenging her authority. She clutched her clipboard like it was a life preserver and took a step closer, invading my personal space in that aggressive way some people do when they're trying to intimidate you. "Well, that's simply not possible," she huffed. "Every house in this neighborhood has been part of the HOA since 1995. There must be some paperwork error. I'll need to see your deed and speak with your real estate agent immediately." The entitlement was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and I had to admire her confidence, even if it was completely misplaced. That's when Sarah appeared at the door, coffee mug in hand, looking like she'd just rolled out of bed, but somehow still managing to radiate an aura of quiet authority that most people spend years trying to develop. "Is everything okay, honey?" she asked, giving Karen the kind of polite but assessing look that made people instinctively straighten their posture. Karen immediately launched into her spiel again, apparently assuming that surely the wife would be more reasonable and compliant than the stubborn husband. "Mrs. Anderson," Sarah supplied. "Mrs. Anderson, I was just explaining to your husband about the HOA membership requirements. Perhaps you could help convince him that joining our community association is really in your best interests." Sarah sipped her coffee and listened patiently while Karen rattled off the supposed benefits of HOA membership, from maintaining property values to organizing community events and ensuring neighborhood standards. When Karen finally paused for breath, Sarah set down her mug and smiled that calm, patient smile that I'd learned meant she was about to shut down someone's nonsense with surgical precision. "Ms. Middleton, I appreciate your enthusiasm for the neighborhood, but as my husband already explained, our property isn't subject to HOA jurisdiction. We've done our due diligence, and we're not interested in voluntarily joining." Karen's face went through several interesting color changes, from pink to red to a shade of purple that probably wasn't healthy. But you can't just opt out. That's not how this works. What about property values? What about community cohesion? What if everyone just decided they didn't want to follow the rules?" Her voice was rising with each word, and I could see curtains twitching in neighboring windows as people started to notice the commotion. Sarah remained perfectly composed, which seemed to irritate Karen even more. "Ms. Middleton, I understand you're passionate about your HOA, but harassment and intimidation aren't going to change our legal position. I'd suggest you consult with your HOA attorney if you believe there's been some error, but I can assure you there hasn't been." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, apparently unable to comprehend that someone might actually stand up to her. "This isn't over," she finally managed to sputter. "I'll be looking into this, and when I find the paperwork proving your property is part of this HOA, you'll be hearing from our legal team." She spun on her heel and marched back to her own house, her clipboard clutched to her chest like armor. Sarah and I watched her go, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of the whole situation. Over the next few weeks, Karen made it her personal mission to make our lives miserable. She started with passive-aggressive notes left on our car windshields about proper parking etiquette, even though we were parked legally on our own driveway. Then came the complaints to the city about our lawn being too tall, even though it was perfectly maintained and well within city ordinances. She called the fire department claiming we were having illegal bonfires when we were just grilling burgers in our backyard. She even tried to get our mail delivery stopped by telling the postal service we didn't live there anymore. Each complaint was dutifully investigated and dismissed, but Karen seemed to view each failure as just another stepping stone to eventual victory. The woman had the persistence of a telemarketer and the subtlety of a freight train. The situation escalated when Karen decided to take her campaign public. She started posting on the neighborhood social media groups about the dangerous precedent we were setting by refusing to join the HOA. According to her posts, we were single-handedly destroying property values, creating chaos in the community, and probably harboring criminals or running some kind of illegal business from our home. She organized a petition demanding that the city force us to comply with HOA regulations, apparently not understanding that the city has no authority to enforce private organization rules on non-members. When that failed, she started following Sarah around the neighborhood, taking pictures of her car, documenting what time she left for work, and generally behaving like a stalker with a clipboard and a persecution complex. Sarah, to her credit, handled the whole situation with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of dealing with difficult people in high-pressure situations. She never lost her temper, never raised her voice, and never gave Karen the dramatic confrontation she seemed to be desperately seeking. This only seemed to frustrate Karen more, and her behavior became increasingly erratic and desperate. She started leaving official-looking notices on our door threatening legal action, fines, and even foreclosure, none of which had any legal basis whatsoever. She called the health department claiming we were running an unlicensed restaurant because she smelled barbecue smoke coming from our backyard. She even tried to get our homeowner's insurance canceled by claiming we were operating a business without proper permits. The final straw came on a Saturday morning when Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. Sarah was working in our front garden, wearing old jeans and a t-shirt, when Karen marched over with her phone already dialed. "That's it. I've had enough of your flagrant disregard for community standards," she shrieked, loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "You people think you can just ignore the rules that the rest of us follow. Well, I'm calling the police right now." Sarah looked up from her flowers with that same calm expression she always wore, dirt smudged on her cheek and gardening gloves on her hands. "Ma'am, you're certainly free to call whoever you'd like, but I'm not sure what you think they'll do about me gardening on my own property." Karen was practically foaming at the mouth at this point, her face red with rage and indignation. "Don't you dare take that tone with me. I am the president of this HOA, and I have authority in this neighborhood. You will comply with our regulations or face the consequences." She jabbed her finger at Sarah like she was casting some kind of spell. "I'm calling 911 right now to report trespassing, disturbing the peace, and destruction of community property." Sarah raised an eyebrow at that last accusation, considering she was kneeling in her own flower bed, but she just shrugged and went back to her planting. Karen dialed 911 with shaking hands, and we could hear her hysterical voice from 20 feet away as she reported that there were dangerous individuals in the neighborhood who were threatening community safety and refusing to comply with lawful orders. The dispatcher must have been confused by the incoherent rambling, but Karen seemed convinced she was about to watch the full force of law enforcement come down on us like the hammer of justice. About 15 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and Karen practically ran out to meet it, waving her arms like she was directing traffic at a disaster scene. A tall officer got out of the car, adjusted his utility belt, and walked over to where Sarah was still calmly tending to her flowers. Karen was right behind him, chattering excitedly about HOA violations and community standards and the need to maintain order in the neighborhood. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. These people have been terrorizing our community for weeks. They refuse to join the HOA, they ignore our regulations, and now they're destroying property." The officer looked around at our perfectly normal front yard, then at Sarah, who had stood up and was brushing dirt off her knees. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Rodriguez. We received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Sarah pulled off her gardening gloves and smiled at the officer with the kind of professional courtesy that comes naturally to people in law enforcement. "Certainly, Officer Rodriguez. I'm Sheriff Sarah Anderson. I was just doing some gardening when Ms. Middleton here became upset about our decision not to join the local HOA." The color drained from Karen's face like someone had pulled a plug, and her mouth fell open so wide I was worried she might dislocate her jaw. Officer Rodriguez straightened up and gave Sarah a respectful nod. "Sheriff Anderson, I apologize for the inconvenience. We weren't aware you lived in this area." Karen looked back and forth between Sarah and the officer like she was watching a tennis match, her brain apparently unable to process what she was hearing. "Sheriff? But she's just a housewife. She can't be a sheriff. She gardens. She wears old clothes. Sheriffs don't look like that." The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. Karen, who had spent weeks harassing a law enforcement officer, calling in false reports, and generally making a nuisance of herself, was now face to face with the very person she'd been trying to have arrested. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but I could see a hint of amusement in her eyes as she watched Karen's world crumble around her. Officer Rodriguez turned to Karen with a much less friendly expression than he'd shown Sarah. "Ma'am, making false reports to 911 is a serious offense. Filing frivolous complaints can result in charges for misuse of emergency services. Would you like to explain why you called in a report about people gardening on their own property?" Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish that had just realized it was no longer in water. I didn't know. I mean, she doesn't look like. How was I supposed to know she was a sheriff?" Karen stammered, her voice getting higher and more desperate with each word. "She never told me. If I had known, I never would have. This is entrapment. She should have identified herself." Sarah chuckled softly and shook her head. "Ms. Middleton, I'm not required to announce my profession to everyone I meet, and being a law enforcement officer doesn't exempt me from your harassment. If anything, your behavior toward a sheriff could be considered especially problematic." Officer Rodriguez was taking notes now, and his expression had gone from mildly annoyed to seriously concerned. "Ma'am, Sheriff Anderson, would you like to file charges for harassment, filing false reports, or misuse of emergency services?" The next few minutes were like watching a slow-motion car crash. Karen's face went through every emotion in the human spectrum, from shock to denial to anger to fear, and finally, settling on pure panic. No. This can't be happening. I'm the HOA president. I was just trying to maintain community standards. I didn't do anything wrong." But her protests fell on deaf ears as Officer Rodriguez continued his investigation. Sarah calmly explained the weeks of harassment, the false complaints to various city departments, the stalking behavior, and the pattern of escalating attempts to force compliance with HOA rules that didn't even apply to our property. With each detail, Karen seemed to shrink a little more, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. Within an hour, Karen found herself facing charges for filing false police reports, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. The HOA board, upon learning of their president's arrest and the legal liability she'd created for the organization, called an emergency meeting that very evening and voted unanimously to remove her from office. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Karen's face was a mask of complete and utter shock, her eyes wide with the dawning realization that her petty power trip had just cost her everything she'd worked to build in the neighborhood.